Welcome in Nashua and beyond to the Picker's Corner. I'm Scott, your host from Picker's Paradise here in Nashua. And last week I tempted you guys all week, all show with this thing sitting in front of me. I never talked about it. So now it's full on Moxie time. So, I mean, if you're from the New England area, you've seen Moxie, you've heard of Moxie. Your grandparents, aunts, uncles probably drank it, tried to give it to you as a child. You thought it was disgusting. So we'll start from the start. We'll start back when Dr. Augustine Thompson decided to come up with this concoction back in 1876. And he was out of Lowell, Mass at the time, but a guy who was originally from the Union, Maine area. So he was down in Lowell. He comes up with this concoction. It's actually a concentrated medicine when he first came out with it. It probably would have been in smaller bottles, sold as, quack medicine type stuff. So he starts making the Moxie then. As it starts getting a little more popular, he starts coming up with stories. Now, the thing I got out of doing my research about Moxie was that this Augustine Thompson guy, sometimes they refer to him as doctor, sometimes they don't. I'm not sure what his actual credentials are, but he was a great storyteller and a salesman for sure. As far as the name Moxie goes, he would always have a story, to tell about how the name was created. And so one of my favorite stories that I found when I was reading about the Moxie origination stories was this one where he knew a guy, Lieutenant Moxie. And this Lieutenant Moxie, he was a friend of Thompson supposedly, and he discovered this South American plant, which we know today to be gentian root. So he supposedly discovered this gentian root when he was down in South America, and that it would, it was amazing cure-all, and that he brought it back and gave it to Thompson, and Thompson created Moxie using this gentian root, which Lieutenant Moxie had brought back with South America. Well, come to find out, the gentian root is actually, there's 400 different species of it, and it lives basically on every continent except for Antarctica. It's really grown in areas that are temperate and also alpine habitats. So you got to have some elevation and you got to have temperate climate. So basically most places on Earth, or most continents on the Earth, have areas in which one of the 400 species will grow. They got cool little blue, usually, and sometimes white flowers on them, which are like little cones almost. And the root is actually still used today. I'm guessing it's still used in Moxie. It was one of the original ingredients of Moxie. But today it's also used in distilled beverages, mostly in Europe, as well as bitters for being added to mostly alcoholic beverages, because the taste is that bitter taste that you actually get when you taste Moxie. So Moxie, most of the time, if you haven't had it, people compare it to a root beer with a really nasty bite at the end of it. And that bite at the end of it is attributed basically to the gentian root. So the actual place where Moxie probably got its name from was from the area where Thompson actually grew up in Maine. So in Maine, there's an Abenaki word, Moxie, which is basically means dark water. And up in the Union area, Lisbon area of Maine, where, Thompson spent most of his time as a child, there were actual bodies of water named Moxie. There's a Moxie Pond up there. There's a Moxie River, I believe. So people tend to believe that the stories that Thompson told about the name origin are just that. They were stories made to get people to buy into the product, or how incredibly rare and great the product was because of the things that were used in it. But we'll move on. So the original contents, including the gentian root, included wintergreen, sassafras, and cocaine originally. So as Thompson has this thing going for a few years, As we said, he started in 1876. Come 1884, he adds carbonation to the mix. And that's when it's rebranded as Moxie Nerve Food. As you might be able to see on this bottle here, it actually says Moxie Nerve Food, Lowell, Massachusetts, which is where he had started at the time. So that's what this bottle is actually from, probably around, definitely after the 1884, where Nerve Food became the name of the beverage. And up until probably we're going to get to in a little while, the early 1900s. So my guess, based on how this bottle actually looks, with the nice embossing here, the fact that the embossing is pretty much all straight line, a lot of the examples you might see if you look up old Moxie Nerve Food bottles, a lot of times you find more of a circular design. This one is pretty much just straight up block letter stamped on there. My guess would be that this one is a little bit older compared to the ones you see with the rounded advertising on it, which was more popular into the 1900s and beyond. This bottle's got a nice blob top on it. It's got a nice little like greenish hue to it as well, or what we call maybe an aqua. And then there's a bunch of bubbles around it. There's a nice big bubble on the sides here. There's one on the bottom, which I don't know if you can get this one right here, actually like right in the bottom of the mold. So this bottle's got some nice characteristics to it that people usually look for in old bottles. It's also, I decided not to clean this one up. Usually, as I described in one of my other shows, I'm a huge bottle cleaner. This one, I kind of left the top intact. I kind of wanted to leave the, I don't know if you can almost call it like scum around the top there. Well, a lot of these bottles, they had a stopper which was also pretty porous, usually a glass or a porcelain or some kind of pottery. And so they actually used to seal the bottles with a little bit of wax as well. So my guess is that some of this is wax, some of the buildup on top is probably also Moxie, which spilled over the top after being poured out. So for the sake and the look of the bottle, I decided to leave it. I think it's pretty cool that there's some brown gunk on the top of this one. Kind of gives it a little bit of a better look to the age. So back to 1884. He adds carbonation, he rebrands it. Now the claims that Thompson was making about what the Moxie beverage was doing, he claimed that it cured drunkards by the thousands very effectively. He said it made homes more happy, that it cured nervous, prostrated, and overworked people, and that it prevented crime and suffering in New England more than any other agencies combined. So I guess, you know, we didn't need anything in New England, no law enforcement or anything like that. We just needed lots and lots of Moxie back in the day. So as we move into the early 1900s, Moxie is literally the favorite soft drink soda in the country and continues to be the best seller until about the 1920s. And by the time that happens, Coca-Cola, which actually came out in 1886, starts to finally overtake Moxie. But Moxie is the original best-selling soda in the United States. So in 1903, Thompson actually passes away. In 1906, the Nerve Food portion of the Moxie name is dropped. And I don't know if it correlates with this, but at the same time, cocaine was removed as one of its ingredients, because at that time it was actually banned by the FDA to be used in food products. So maybe the Nerve Food part got dropped because of the cocaine withdrawal, maybe not, who knows. So it moves on just as Moxie from that point on. A year later, in 1907, Moxie sues Modocs for the first time in Boston. And Modocs, as you can see, the name is pretty similar to Moxie. It was a competitor who basically had very similar ingredients to Moxie and was being sold pretty much as a Moxie knockoff. Moxie ends up suing Modocs again in New York sometime later, and actually ends up winning that lawsuit for infringement. And basically Modocs goes out of business shortly thereafter. But you can still find Modocs bottles around. I've found a few of them myself. They're pretty cool. Moxie collectors, I'm not sure how much of them actually look for Modocs bottles, but you know, if you collect the Moxie, why not collect the knockoff that it took out along the way? So into the 1910s, as I said, it was one of the greatest selling sodas up until, or was the greatest selling soda up until it was surpassed by Coca-Cola sometime in the 1920s. But before then, it remained the best-selling soda because of a guy named Frank Archer. Now, Frank Archer was a Moxie employee. He started the company as a clerk. He worked his way up to be the head of advertising. And when he was the head of advertising, he came up with all kinds of different advertising slogans, songs. He was basically the creator of a lot of the Moxie style that you see today. If you're familiar with Moxie and that guy pointing, supposedly that's actually him, Frank Archer. He is the Moxie man in those advertisements. He also created these horsemobiles, which they were actually driving these things around selling soft drinks basically on the streets, in parks, in places like that. I don't know if it was revolutionary at the time. I don't know if there were plenty of other carts going around selling Cokes. But so he definitely kicked the Moxie brand into high gear during his time. He actually was very good at framing Moxie and advertising it as a whiskey replacement. If you'll remember, the Prohibition was from 1919 to 1933. So a lot of times it had already been advertised and sold as a way to cure drunkards. It was given to people after they had reached their limit at the bar. It was something that, you know, kind of tasted similar, had a bite to it like beer and alcohol does. Won't get you intoxicated though. I don't know, the cocaine back in the day might have got you a little loopy. And maybe straightened you out from being drunk as well at the same time, who knows. But so he actually started marketing and selling Moxie as a replacement for whiskey during the Prohibition. So the Frank Archer era ends basically as Coca-Cola ends up surpassing Moxie as the best-selling, and subsequently he passes away in 1937. We're going to go all the way ahead to 1940. So in the 1940s, Ted Williams becomes a huge advertising partner with Moxie. And they actually create a product for him called Ted's Root Beer. So you'll actually see a lot of Ted's Root Beer stuff in this area. It was very popular in this area. The advertising is great. Of course, it's got Ted Williams, famous Red Sox outfielder. And it's got the same look and feel and all the advertising swag kind of that the Moxie brand brought along with it. And the Ted's was absolutely, as well as Moxie, known for its advertising. And, you know, it's still popular today with collectors, absolutely. In 1962, Diet Moxie hits the market. In 1966, Moxie is actually sold to the Monarch Beverage Company in Atlanta. And so it actually ends up in 2007 being sold back again to, at this point, it's called Cornucopia Beverage Company, and it's located in Bedford, New Hampshire here. And the Cornucopia Beverage Company is actually a subsidiary or owned by Coca-Cola bottling of northern New England. And then a bunch of other companies own that. It's a huge, yeah. Ends up, so Moxie at 2007 was end up being owned by a Japanese company pretty much. But I digress. So in 2011, Cornucopia Beverage Company actually changes its name or starts doing business as the Moxie Beverage Company. In 2018, Moxie ends up selling to Coca-Cola, the parent company Coca-Cola, and so that's actually who still owns it and produces it today. So Moxie is still something you can find on the shelf. A couple more interesting Moxie tidbits. So in 2005, Moxie became the Maine soft drink of the state, basically, or Maine, state soft drink. At the height of its production, Moxie was available in 30 plus states and in Canada. If you think about how big the scope is of the beverage companies that you see today, it's kind of almost, it boggles your mind that back when Moxie was at its height and, you know, was the #1 selling brand, it really only got to be sold in about 30 or so states. It's just, it really makes you think about how small the nation was back, you know, in those early 1900s. Now it's basically only available in the 6 New England states. So pretty much if you're outside of New England and you try to go to a local store to try to find Moxie, you're probably not going to find it because they really don't distribute it any further than New England. In Lisbon, Maine, there's actually a 3-day Moxie Festival, and that's the 2nd week of July, I believe, every year. And there's also there's the Matthews Museum of Maine Heritage, and that's in Union, Maine, the birthplace or hometown, I should say, of Thompson, the creator of Moxie. And there's actually a Moxie wing on that museum, so you can go in and see all kinds of Moxie stuff from back in the day when Thompson first started it. And I didn't know this, but Clark's Trading Post here in New Hampshire actually has the last known horsemobile on display. So if you want to see a piece of Moxie history from, you know, around the 19-teens, Clark's Trading Post evidently is a great place to do that. So we're going to move on from talking about this awesome Moxie bottle and the Moxie company. It was really kind of surprising to me how difficult it was to find a lot of good information on the Moxie company and the Moxie story in general. And it was also pretty hard to find information about where this thing came from. So I had gotten this on a pick quite a while ago and had kind of like worked around it. I thought it's pretty simple. Basically what it is it's a little ashtray and cigarette holder with some places to put either matches or lighters. It's got a little compartment underneath it where you could store a few things. But the thing that led me to a cool story was the stamp, or the little label that's on the bottom of this, that's partially removed at this point. But this piece was actually created by the Shenandoah community workers. So I started doing a little research on that and actually found a pretty cool story, which I had shared back on the shop's Facebook page back in January. So this might be revisiting a little bit of history if you followed the shop back then. But this little wooden piece that was created by the Shenandoah community workers, the story is really kind of cool. So in the early 1920s, in the base area of Virginia, which is an extremely rural area, it's kind of on the northern part of Virginia, pretty much on the border of West Virginia up there. Pretty rural. People are really kind of, the poverty is awful in that area. And so a guy who actually got out of there, it seems like, it was hard, like I said, it was hard finding information. But so a Philadelphia banker and philanthropist named William Bernard Clark founds the Shenandoah community workers and builds what is called Birdhaven, I think. Yep, Birdhaven, on his grandmother's land in this area of Virginia. So evidently, my theorizing is that Bernard Clark actually really was concerned about that area, having his grandmother had lived there Maybe he spent time with her when he was growing up. Maybe he grew up there himself. But he ends up going back, or understanding how hard it is for people in that area. So he goes back, he builds Bird Haven, and basically creates industry there for basically the people who are all unemployed and very poor. At the height of its time at Bird Haven, there were up to 30 employees there at the Shenandoah Community Workers. They really started in the 1920s, and all they did basically was wooden toys and some puzzles and things like that. With time, they actually started creating larger things. They created small pieces of furniture. They actually did cast iron, as well as some kitchen utensils, bowls, and some other wooden craft things like this. So a lot of the times they basically used materials that they could find in the area, and they actually ended up selling all this stuff because, again, the area they were in Virginia, pretty rural, pretty out there. So they ended up creating mail order catalogs where they ended up selling all this through. A lot of the sales initially were in the Virginia areas, the mid-Atlantic coast areas, even up through New England. And as time went on into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they were actually nationwide catalogs. So they would actually get shipped all over. There was accounts of Hollywood stars that bought pieces there and had it shipped from Virginia out to them in California, and those types of stories. So the company actually stayed in business for about 40 years. It closed in the early 1960s. And one of the pities of looking up, trying to find information about this, was that even if you look at sites from the area, there's a lot of people who are actually trying to find the actual history of what happened there, what was created. Some of the mail order catalogs are around. Of course, there are some pieces, such as this one, that were created at the Bird Haven site in Shenandoah. But as you can see, the workmanship on this piece is pretty much flawless. The way that the wood is all put together. And because, like I said, the place went out of business in 1961. So this piece has to be at least that age. My guess, based on the way that it's labeled, these labels were used a lot into the 1950s. So I'm guessing that this piece is probably a 1950s piece. Also based on the way it's designed and things like that too, I'd probably say 1950s. So looking at the workmanship on it and the fact that the wood has stayed together this well, it's not coming apart anywhere, there's no loose parts, there's no warping and things like that. So whoever did this skillfully has made a piece that's actually lasted the last, was that 1950s to now, 70 plus years. And it looks almost like someone could have made it in a shop class here at Nashua. So it's a pretty amazing piece. It's got this nice copper in here too that I forgot to mention the last time. It's got a little copper tray that's nailed in there. It's got a nice little ruffled edge from where it was actually like hammered out by hand. And it's just, it's really cool to have a piece that, was at the time, at the height of it, it was a 30 people shop. So you got to figure that some of those people were in shipping, receiving, raw materials. So it was a relatively small little industry created in an area that was very rural. Who knows how far the people actually had to travel to be able to get to work every day. But it's just, it's a nice story about how someone who had the means is helping to take care of people in a community that they know and love and that is struggling. So just a nice little cool piece. But that will do it for me this week. So thanks for joining us again, and next week we'll have some more cool stuff to talk about. I'm going to tease a little bit. I'm picking up a piece of Nashua history on Thursday this week from a buddy of mine down in Massachusetts that he found while he was out picking. So it's nice to have picking friends and a little picking community of your own. If you look for things and your buddies look for other things, it's a nice way to, you know, find things for people and then also have them find things for you. So next week, we're definitely going to be talking a little bit of Nashua. So thanks again, and I'll see you next week.